Hey, welcome to the Standing for Freedom podcast, where we defend life, liberty, and truth for the next generation. It is now no secret that one of the most insidious attacks on our education system today is brought about by ideologues and activists who are working as teachers and educators, often planting dangerous and deadly propaganda in the minds of our youth, especially when it relates to American history. Critical race theory, as many of you are aware now, is a dangerous ideology driving towards a common goal of instilling that false belief that everything is about division and struggle, the oppressor and the oppressed. Our nation's history, far from perfect, is crucial not only to our national identity, but to our common identity. Regardless of our feelings, the fact is that we are all Americans. We have one national history, not two, just as we have one identity as Americans. We share that identity because of our citizenship in this nation. We are beholden to certain ideals, principles, ethics, and even morals as Americans. More recently, the 1619 Project, funded by the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, has been the focal point of that discussion. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who acts as an activist rather than a historian to offer a theory of history rather than an actual history, she is one of the key figures behind the 1619 Project. It is considered one of the most diabolical, racially charged, and self-destructive works in modern history. On the other side, there is the 1776 Unites Project that was launched in response in February of 2020 by actual historians like Robert Woodson, Carol Swain, Shelby Still, and many others who are seeking to promote the real history of this country that does not paint in pale pastels or in thin veneers, but the tragedies and the triumphs of American civil life are fully exposed. Now more than ever, Americans are at a crossroads and a crisis when it comes to our common identity. Whether 1619 or 1776, it is important for Americans to recognize who they are and what their true history is. We discuss all of that and more on the Standing for Freedom podcast, starting now. 1619 or 1776, will the real America please stand up? Welcome to a special edition of the Freedom Center podcast, where we defend life, liberty, and truth to ensure that the foundations of freedom exist for the next generation. I'm joined today by two Liberty professors, Dr. Kerry Roberts. He's Dean of Online Programs in the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor of History, as well as Dr. Sam Smith, Professor and Chair in the History Department and author of the most recent book, Among the Deplorables, Confessions of a Populist Evangelical. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Well, the times are interesting, to say the least. When you think about where we are culturally, politically here in the United States, it seems as though the long march through the institutions has presented us with a crisis. There is deconstruction everywhere. When you think about American history, we no longer have a common shared understanding of that history, which is why we're even discussing this topic today, 1619 versus 1776. And I wanted y'all just to give me a brief background about the 1619 Project. First of all, what is it and who's behind that?
1619 Project was a celebration of the 400th anniversary of the first African slaves who came to Virginia in 1619. And what the 1619 Project has tried to do, and by their own words, to reframe American history, to point to 1619 as the centerpiece of American history, not 1776. And they're very, very upfront about that notion. And their point is that the principles of freedom and liberty espoused in 1776 and then in the Constitution of 1787, following that, were false when they were done, because people like Jefferson and Madison and Washington and others owned slaves. And so they take the concept of slavery and make that the main point of American history. It's very much infused with sort of an ideological flair of the oppressed versus the oppressor. It's very much imbued with critical race theory, oriented around tearing down so that in their eyes you can build back up. And so writers like Nicole Hannah Jones, Matthew Desmond, sociologist at Princeton, and others, mostly African American scholars, but not all, were part of this effort. It came out and it was very much criticized by leading historians, not conservative historians, just leading historians, because not only does it have this infusion of ideology underneath the surface, it has a lot of historical errors. One being the notion that the American Revolution was fought to defend slavery, which is absolutely ludicrous. There's no evidence whatsoever. They use the Dunmore Proclamation, which was the Virginia, a British governor of 1775, in November 1775, proclaimed that if slaves would escape the plantation, he would give them their freedom and they could be part of the British defense. And that kind of thing, they use those kind of isolated incidences to argue that the American Revolution was about defending slavery. And leading historians, Gordon Wood, Sean Willents, James McPherson, James Oakes, Victoria Bynum, and others who are not conservatives but are good historians, who argued that these are just factually wrong.
Yeah.
And it's not just that one. That's not the only problem. There are plenty of historical errors throughout the 1619 project.
And Dr. Roberts, just, what in the more contemporary, in terms of the appraisal, how is this viewed? 1619, is it seen as something that we should it's trustworthy, that we should all use as our curriculum? The authors that are even behind it, how are they viewed?
One way of understanding the 1619 project is not so much as an academic enterprise as it is a reflection of the values, the sentiments, the memory of a particular side of the American elite. It is an elite project produced by those who are part of that segment of society, and in many ways it's aimed at other members of that segment of American society today. They are the ones who appreciate it most. They're the ones who have provided awards for the people who are involved in this project. And so for the rest of us, we kind of sit around on the sidelines wondering, well, how could anyone make these claims? But in fact, those who are within professions, teaching professions specifically, they rely heavily upon people like this. So we have to be very careful not to just dismiss things like the 1619 project. It's just sort of an academic enterprise.
Yeah.
We'll let academics deal with it. It's not going to be something that touches my life, when in fact it very much touches your life and touches the life of your children, your grandchildren, and those really within your communities. People within your community are being educated not to honor, respect, and draw inspiration from the past, but to be ashamed of it.
Yeah.
To be ashamed of our origins, to be ashamed of the founding era, to be ashamed of people we once venerated. So this really is a crisis of authority that can have all sorts of profound consequences going forward.
So it's an ideology that replaces history. Everything is looked through a critical lens of suspicion, where things are now no longer what they seem. And if you turn over history, if you look underneath the rocks, if you look at all the evidence, we don't actually have heroes, right? These are all immoral figures that need to be uprooted. Their statues need to come down, right? All of these things. So, Dr. Smith, obviously, when you talk about 1619 Project, you can't say that without at least discussing critical race theory, and then underneath that or behind that, critical theory, Hegelian dialectic, and really German idealism. So I want to kind of talk through, kind of chart through, map that out. What is all of that about that's sort of in the backdrop of the 1619 Project?
Yeah, I think you can go back to Immanuel Kant and his critique of pure reason, and in his critique of practical reason, where he argues that the concept of reason and rationality are really a figment of the imagination. They're not really real. That if you can think it, then you're in a phenomenal world that's not real. And so that creates an undergirding for all kinds of bad thinking, in my opinion. Hegel, for example, would come in that strain of thought of German idealism, that God is the state marching on the earth, and that the way you get to truth, or what you think might be truth, is that you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, and they struggle, and you have a synthesis. And then the synthesis becomes the thesis, and then the struggle goes on and on.
Where do you see that in, by the way, just real fast, that's a perfect example, but where do you see that in politics even?
Well, I think you see that in the sense of, well, when I'll think of Chinese politics. That's what reminds me of all of this, the Hegelian principle of the Maoist struggle sessions that were encouraged by Mao to struggle against your professors to students, struggle against your parents, struggle against anybody that owns anything. And then after all that, struggle against your leaders within the revolution. It was madness, but it was this ongoing cycle of struggle it's all about tearing down with this kind of strange utopian idea that something good at the end is going to happen. Really though, when you look at communism, socialism, Nazism, all of these authoritarian regimes, it's about leading to their own centralized authority and having a centralized authority to be able to rule over the masses. And the way you do that is that you keep them in tension with each other. And now that may be, some people may see that as a far cry from something like the 1619 Project. I don't. I see undergirding the 1619 Project, and if you read it, it's not really as much to me about race as it is about tearing down our own culture.
Explicate that a little bit more. So what do you mean by that?
Tearing down our founding principles, saying that these founders were really bad and that they were false and they were hypocrites, and not appreciating the tension. We know that our founders owned slaves. We know that was not good. But the world context at that time was a world of slavery. And so the idea that you can take America and isolate it off as a straw man and say, and almost as if slavery really started here in 1619 without looking at the world context, is really unhistorical. History is about context. It's about understanding things in the context of the times. History is not about being a bludgeon to destroy, and it's not about a banner to overly praise. History is to understand the past, not to be used in a presentist way to try to shape things in the way that you think they should be. And that's a problem, I think, with the 1619 Project.
And when you think about imperialism, British imperialism, Spanish imperialism, so on and so forth, the Dutch, Netherlands, France, what nation was not participating in slavery for that 400, 500-year period?
The Dutch were the masters of the high sea, one of the most prominent slave trading nations. And it unfortunately was the reality. And another thing that 1619 Project tries to do is it really attacks capitalism and free market, and saying that capitalism was really this nefarious, profit-oriented, greedy notion, and that's why slavery existed and prospered. When in fact, free market ideas, growing capitalism, was really what eventually called attention to the problems of slavery.
Right, yeah.
And rather than capitalism being the cause of slavery, as the 1619 Project seems to want to say, I would place it as one of the reasons that slavery eventually ended.
It was the impetus behind the abolitionist movement, right, in moving
the
forward.
networking that comes along with capitalism. We know, for example, that slaves in the colonial period had a rougher time, a harder time than slaves during the antebellum period. That is a historical fact. And why is that? Well, a lot of it was because of the profit motive within a capitalist mindset. It's not to justify slavery, but the profit motive within a capitalist mindset that says, I own these slaves. I don't want to be mistreating them to the point to where they die because I lose profit. Now that's a very
utilitarian,
cold,
sure.
That's a utilitarian, very cold concept.
Right.
But it points to the problem of the 1619 Project using capitalism as the cause of American slavery.
And by the way, and I want to characterize how we're talking about this. This is not a cold, pedantic approach to history. We're just saying that there is nuance and complexity here, and so you're describing that for us.
Well, this is why all of these concerns about historical subjects create such controversy that spill out from the academy into wider ranges of American society. As a discipline, history depends upon complexity. That's how we teach it. That's how we understand it, to use Dr. Smith's phrase. We cannot properly understand the past unless we're willing to accept that complexity. And we realize there are lots of different pieces of that puzzle. When we use the term ideology or ideological thinking, we mean something very specific by that. We don't mean that ideology is a synonym for ideas, which is the way a lot of people use it, right, in our society. We mean that this is a particular way of thinking about the world. It is to reduce all human existence down to one theme. This is the Hegelian route of thesis and antithesis to the synthesis, right? Reducing everything down through struggle to one particular theme. For example, Marxists, traditional Marxists, would look at all of human history and all of human existence as the exploitation of workers by the owners of production.
Right.
Feminists will see all of human existence as characterized by men using patriarchal institutions to exploit women. Environmentalists will see all of human existence geared toward this effort to control nature, and in doing so, destroy nature and eventually itself, right? It's self-destructive. So what the 1619 Project does, and what this sort of new wave of Marxism is doing, whether it's critical race theory or other tools, is to reduce all of American history down to one thing. There's no complexity to that. So they are actually rewriting or reframing, to use the term that they are saying, reframing everything in American life in terms of slavery. So this is why they can get away with saying that traffic jams in Atlanta are caused by slavery, or right to work laws and states are somehow connected to slavery. This is how they reduce everything ideologically down to that particular path. And it's also why when they define capitalism, they have to define capitalism as originating in slavery, right? So once they have tainted capitalism with this origin, then anything associated with capitalism must in turn also be tainted with these vile things. And we either shame those things, or we shame people who look to positive elements of those things. And there is no end to this.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, and so, and by the way, that is what shuts down any kind of discussion, because then these topics, even talking about them, it becomes taboo. To even look under the hood at these histories, that kind of discussion becomes verboten. I think of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, right? In Rod Dreher's more recent book, Live Not by Lies, he talks about that Eastern Europe, Poland and the like, you couldn't have these discussions, behind the Soviet wall. And here we are now in 2021, and it seems as though in our American society, we're no longer free to discuss these issues, and they're trying to set up a whole new historic and cultural hegemony. So eliminate history. The facts of history no longer matter. We can allegorize history. We can speak of histories in terms of ideological. It must be right because I know that the end game is right. So therefore, the facts don't matter so long as we're leading towards this brave new world.
Jake Silverstein, the editor of the New York Times Magazine, when confronted with these historians, Sean Willents, James McPherson, Gordon Wood, and others, he said, well, we're journalists, we're not historians. But their project was to reframe American history. So you have to get your history right. Now I want to go back to something Dr. Roberts was talking about, this oneness, where you have to bring it to one thing. That really reminds me of theologian Peter Jones' approach, where he says that really the world is divided between oneism and twoism. And the oneism being this idea of, everything is God, or everything is nothingness, or the holy other. It's just this one. It's very mystical. It goes to one thing. Whereas the Orthodox Christian view understands there's the creator and the creation, like the twoism, right? And so there's this understanding we have an obligation to our creator.
Yeah.
And that he is the ultimate. Not this idea that within our own realm we can reach this utopian oneness.
Right.
And really I do, it reminds me when I read things like the 1619 Project, or read some of the critical race theory articles, even some of the lawyers like Crenshaw and Bell and others who really kind of started the critical race theory in the law schools. Mm-hmm. It's this idea of getting to this one thing, and it's all about one thing. And their one thing is they call it the original sin, racism. And to shape all of history around one thing is the lazy man's approach to history.
Yes.
It's not the right approach, where history is very, very complex.
It's interesting that if you're looking at the framing of an ideology, if you really are an activist and you're really trying to mobilize, first of all, hijack the thinking, the brains of the next generation, you really do need to make it easy and palatable for most people. And so I can see where if you flatten everything, here's what it is. No, there's nothing outside of this. This is it. You present it that way. There is no alternative. There is no debate. There is no dichotomy. There's none of that. It makes it as an easy belief system to pick up, much like what happened in the 1920s and the 1930s.
Well, conservatives have to be cognizant of this, and we have to also be very careful, because our strategy, the tempting strategy, is to simply respond to these ideological overtures with our own version of them. So there's a great deal to be said with the strategy of the 1776 Project and what it is calling attention to that is erroneous and dangerous with the 1619 Project. But that's only one. There's also a 1620 Project. There's a 1607 project.
Right.
Why there's not a 1585 project, I'm not sure. That's when Elizabeth I's courtiers convinced her that she should support colonization of North America. In other words, all of these efforts are trying to find one date, one event that defines true America. The real America will stand up. Well, is that 1776, 1619, 1585, right? So all of this has merit, but it can also lead us down the same treacherous path if we're not careful. History is complex. American exceptionalism is complex. There are many things that make us different from other people in the world. Even within the United States, there are many things that make us different. So this emphasis on oneness can also be a temptation for us that we really have to avoid.
Speaking of American exceptionalism, James Oakes, a very well-known American historian who was one of the signers against the 1619 Project, has written tons of books on slavery, one of the leading scholars on slavery in America. He said that the 1619 Project picked the most unexceptional thing about American history and tried to make it the thing that America was exceptional about, and that would be slavery. Because in the world context, slavery was everywhere. And the idea that you isolate that and make that all that American history is about is really to take the most unexceptional thing and make it the instrument of American exceptionalism. And he points out that that's just a really skewed way of thinking about history. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I don't know who said it. It's been said many times, but America's failure, America's sin is universal, right? It is not unique in that. But the things that make America truly great are the things that make it exceptional. It's unique in the world. It's uniqueness with the other nations. And so on that note, I think that's a good segue into 1776. You referred to the 1776 Project. Hey, I personally like the year 1517 myself. I think that redefined history for many people, and for those you who are historians, you know what that is. But in 1776, we had something that really did change history. And not just for the United States, but many other nations modeled their constitutions, their founding documents out of we have the Declaration of Independence, but what also happened in 1787. So let's talk about the 1776 Project, who's behind it, what's the impetus behind that, and then let's go from there.
1776 Project, really, I would say the main mover behind that is Robert Woodson, a wonderful African-American scholar, conservative, and he has the Woodson Institute, and he and several other African-American scholars and non-African-American scholars, frankly, come together and said the 1619 Project is dangerous, especially dangerous because it's finding its way into many of our schools. And they believe that its focus is too much on victimization, that it's too ideological, that it's embedded with critical race theory. Scholars like Carol Swain, John McWhorter, at Columbia University. Shelby Steele, a tremendous scholar. His book, White Guilt, for example, is fantastic. And 1619 reminds me a lot of what he writes about in his book, White Guilt. He says that white guilt has replaced white supremacy as the controlling mechanism of the elite. And when you really look at 1619, you kind of see that it's embedded with this idea of whites must feel guilty about their past. They must feel guilty about the founding. I see that as a controlling mechanism. But the 1776 project is very practical. It even uses the term radical practicality. It's very dissenter-oriented, which I love. They make a point on their website, get this out to kids in home schools, in the home, Sunday schools, wherever, and teach these principles of American freedom, of the consent of the governed, right? The liberties that we've received from God. And these must be appreciated. Yes, there's tensions, there's problems in American history, there's problems in every country's history. But you don't focus on those things exclusively. Yeah. And that's what the 1619 Project is really doing. It's focusing on the negative. And if you do that year after year, the results are going to be very problematic in this country. If you go with things like the 1776 Project, which I don't think has the same financial backing that the 1619 Project has. I hope it does eventually, because they're trying to start their own curriculum and so forth. So I applaud what they're doing. I think it's a wonderful movement.
To think that all the money would be behind something like 1619 is just unfathomable. And when you think about that, there is a suspicion there. Why is that? And why are they so well funded? We think about what happened in the summer of protest last year, summer of love, as some people call it. But there were a lot of big foundations, the Ford Foundation behind Black Lives Matter Incorporated, that were funding it to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars to make sure that they were represented, not peaceful protests, in many ways violent protests. There was a lot of vandalism, destruction of private property, all of those things. But when you look at it and you think, why is it that there is so much funding behind something like 1619? What would you say to that?
I would say it goes back to the media, because corporations understand that those that control the outlets of information will have an impact on their own profit margin.
Yeah.
And so American media, unfortunately, is inundated with these principles, very, very leftist, very oriented toward leftist ideology. I mean, think about it. It was the New York Times Magazine that put out the 1619 Project.
That's right. Yep.
And so I think a lot of corporations understand that. I wish they didn't go in that direction, but a lot of times they do that because of the power of the American media.
Yeah. Well, we're in the era of, and we won't even get into this discussion, but of woke capital, ESG, environmental social governance, and people like Larry Fink and others to the tune of trillions of dollars that are now funding a lot of social justice movements, not only in corporate America, but then also the activists as well. Let's talk about why this controversy not only matters to historians and those who are in the academic profession, but why does it also matter to the everyday person? So I'm thinking of everybody from those who are in the kindergarten all the way up, who are students, but then also I'm thinking of even grandma and grandpa who are retired right now.
Well, I think really there is a war on populist America, on the common man in many ways, and a lot of the ammunition from that war is coming from the halls of learning and in the media outlets. And when you look at something like the 1619 Project, it is much more than just academics arguing among themselves. It is finding its way into our schools, finding its way into curriculum. And that will have a detrimental effect in our communities, when, especially if it really gets widespread. I mean, you look on the news and parents are starting to stand up to school boards today about the issues of critical race theory. And when I look at that, I think they're really holding the line. These parents that are willing to stand up and say, not with my child.
And I'm seeing this happen, by the way, as you mentioned, I'm seeing this happen in blue states and red states and blue states. So South Lake, Texas, that, you know, two parents running for school board. And I also saw a New Jersey mom really going after a school board on critical race theory just last week, and you know, in a very blue Democratic area.
And I'll say another area. In the evangelical churches, this is a tremendous problem. It's found its way into a lot of the seminaries, even some that we would think is conservative seminaries, where critical race theory is seen as sort of this usable analytical tool to approach the way we orient ourselves related to race, when in fact it's not just an analytical tool. It is a worldview. And when you start using that, something that's antithetical to a biblical worldview, and that's plugged into your theology, and that's plugged into the preaching, and that's plugged into the Sunday school class, you can well imagine the problem, not just in the schools, but in the churches. In evangelical churches, we're seeing this problem. And so,
on the note of the seminaries, what do you think that is? Is it a part of new academic programming to get people excited to come to seminary? What do you think is behind that?
I have my own view on this. I think it has to do with sentiment. You know, as evangelicals, we love people, and we want to help people. We want to help hurting people, and so. You know, we have a certain sentiment toward those who struggle. And I think some people see this as a way, right, to help, as a way to connect, say, with African American communities and so forth. When in fact, they've allowed the emotion of sentiment, which is a good thing, to mask the problems of the tool or the worldview that they're using. And I think that's a recipe for disaster in the American churches. You know, they say that love covers a multitude of sins. Well, ideology covers a multitude of falsehoods.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
If you're an American a leader, if you have any kind of leadership position, and you are convinced that, as Dr. Smith was saying, the American media is a mirror of American society in general, that what the media elite values mirrors what rank and file Americans also value, then you're basing your decisions on a lot of false signals. And so you are inviting in things like critical race theory or other types of tools that are really designed more for control than they are understanding. You're inviting these things in on the assumption this is what students are demanding. And if you want those students, then you've got to be able to provide them with these tools that you assume they really want. It's a false signal. It is something that can actually cripple your institution going forward, whether it's a church, whether it's a seminary, even whether it's a corporation. There is a lifespan to these things, and you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak. And if this is all you're delivering your customers or your congregation, then you're going to face a very serious point in time when there's going to have to be some sort of reckoning on this.
Yeah, no, it's very, very well said and a good point. What's the end game? First of all, what should be the strategy going forward for those who are concerned about truth? Obviously, the response to the 1776 Project, that alone won't be enough. But what should be the response of those who love freedom, understand the exceptional qualities of American history, and certainly we failed in many ways to live up to all the promises that were given in 1776. But if you look at the history of what happened in the American Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement and many other things that happened in between, there were moments where we got it right. So what should be our strategy?
Well, as a historian, as the chair of a history department, I firmly believe we really need to get back to the roots of American history. We need to teach our kids American history, and not just from textbooks, but go through documents like the Declaration of Independence, like the Constitution of the United States, and read history, and introduce kids to the characters of history, the good and the bad. And don't be afraid to pick heroes in American history. That's not a bad thing. Now, you always have to be careful. I write about American religious history, and some of the people I write about, George Whitefield, John Wesley, people like that, I really admire. They're kind of like my heroes in history. But some of the things I've written about, I've pointed out problems with them. So history is about reality. It's about being real. And so introducing students to history. I saw somebody the other day on social media, they said, if you could go back to your 18-year-old self and give yourself 3 words of instruction, what would it be? And I wrote, read the Bible.
Yeah, good.
And so that would be my next thing. We need to get back to the scriptures. We need to get back to the truth of God's word.
There are some deeper strategic problems going forward that conservative-minded Americans have got to address and come to terms with. And in many ways, we have to be asking ourselves, why is it that the left seems to occupy so much cultural ground? Why does the left occupy all the ground for defending specific communities across the American landscape? Why does the left occupy all of these different places where people are attracted to them because they sense that they are defending their interests against some large, ominous threat? Why is that? And I'm sad to say, I think part of it is because conservative-minded Americans have abandoned the ground of common culture. We have placed so much emphasis and poured so many resources into a defense of, frankly, very abstract things, right?
Yeah.
Western civilization. Well, I like Western civilization. You like Western
Sure.
civilization? We all like Western civilization.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But we no longer know how to defend common, everyday custom. We have allowed others to shame us and to only instill guilt over these daily, everyday habits that really are the things that make our lives worth living. We've got to recapture a strategy that equips people to defend these things. Because right now, the only thing that exists in our educational system, even sadly in some of our churches, is that we have to hate these things, right? Right. The problem we face, Ryan, why this matters to every member of your audience is that we no longer have anywhere to hide.
Yeah.
There is no room for private life. There's no room for common culture. If you buy into these ideological sentiments, everything has to revolve around whatever that ideology is based upon. So I've said this before, and it seems kind of simple, but we need to learn again how to love things. We've got to learn how to love the things that make our lives valuable and worth living. We've got to learn to take care of those things and defend those things. And frankly, these are the matters of common culture. And people who say the culture wars were a mistake, or who say we've got to go beyond the culture wars, they have fundamentally misread the problems that we really are facing. If we're going to go forward, if we're going to really see all the things that we value empowered once more, we're going to have to learn to love these things again.
Yeah.
And not let people shame us for doing so.
That's very well said. You know, one of the things that I think too is we're a victim of our own sort of theological devices in the evangelical community, and evangelical conservatives in particular. If you look at the past 100 years, this is my own just opinion here, but a preoccupation with end-time eschatology and the imminence of Christ's return, and I don't mean in the biblical sense, I mean in the non-biblical sense. I mean in the kind of speculation that often it draws in and draws so much attention to, whereas historically, for hundreds of years, we were institution builders. We built the great universities, we built hospitals, we built all kinds of things, not just great churches. And Martin Luther was once asked, you know, if Jesus was to return tomorrow, what would you do? He said, I'd plant a tree. And I'd be busy about doing the things that matter the long term. And we've got to get back to that very thing. And part of that is this sort of civic engagement. You said it best. There is no other place to hide. Too many times we've forfeited things and said, well, we'll just retreat back. There's nowhere else to go. We've retreated back on just about everything, you know, whatever the government doesn't control, it's controlled by the private sector, and the church has very, very little involvement there. And so we've got to get back to doing those things again and doing them very well. So I think that's very well put. Final comments, whether it be 1619 or 1776, as we wrap up.
Well, I think, and just to trail off what Dr. Roberts said, I think of Ludwig von Mises, Austrian economist, who, you know, if you study economics, it's all about theory and charts and so forth. Well, his approach to economics is the title of his magnum opus, Human Action, right? It was about what humans do. It's what they value, what they choose. And I think historians need to look at human action and look at, you know, why do people do what they do? What on the ground causes them to do that? And that's back to the idea of culture and life, everyday living. You know, study English common law, for example, case law. These were laws that were developed out of practical circumstances over hundreds of years that came over into our American system. It's about precedent. It's about human action over time, and learning that and appreciating that. Understanding there's always going to be tensions within that matrix, but appreciating the good things that you see. So I think the 1776 project is doing that. It's appreciating the human action of our founders and what they did. Not perfect people, but people who changed our lives and changed the world with the concepts of liberty and freedom.
Good.
You know, as believers, we're called to love sinners. Now, that never at any point means we endorse the sin that sinners are guilty of, that you're guilty of, I'm guilty of, even Dr. Smith is guilty of. But when we meet that calling to love, we also accept the failings and the frailties. We accept the humiliation. We accept the hardship. We accept the struggles. We accept the mistakes without endorsing the sin that drove those things to fruition. And this, in many ways, is a winning strategy that I think we can adopt culturally. It is a strategy that we can adopt politically, socially. You know, I want to solve traffic jams in Atlanta. I want to solve and achieve serious criminal justice reform. I certainly endorse the efforts to make our communities and our lives occupying better places. But in order to get there, we're going to have to abandon these ideological reframings of where we came from. Because only by understanding the complexity of human existence are we really able to understand deeply the consequences of our actions. Where we can see, to borrow from French philosophers, what is seen and what is not seen.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not making mistakes where we're paving the road to perdition with good intentions, right? We want to pave a different road with good intentions, but we want to make sure we don't go down the wrong fork.
Very well said. Well, thank you both for joining this special edition of the Freedom Center podcast. Dr. Carey Roberts, Dr. Sam Smith, thank you.
Thank you.